On to my topic, non-remedial value of dependence on moral testimony. I'm going to start by asking you to imagine. Your partner comes home from work one day and tells you that his boss made a discriminatory hiring decision. Your friend tells you you should be a vegan on moral grounds. Your priest tells you that polyamory is wrong. For most of us, cases like these, or somewhat in the ballpark, are familiar. Moral testimony, or just to put it simply, testimony with moral content, is a pervasive feature of our lives. In fact, it seems like the dependence on moral testimony, including moral testimony, is, to quote Hume, necessary to human life. How, after all, could children develop into full moral agents if they did not, as they mature, rely on moral testimony? But while it's relatively plain to see that dependence on moral testimony is pervasive in our moral lives, it's far more difficult to articulate the nature and assess the justifiability, epistemic and moral, of such dependence. So at the heart of the controversy surrounding dependence on moral testimony that I want to explore today is what is called in the literature the asymmetry thesis. This is the idea that while testimony is a perfectly fine source for moral belief, what time it is, how old someone is, how many siblings they have, there's something problematic about basing one's moral beliefs on testimony. It is this sort of objection to moral testimony, rather than global skepticism about testimony per se, that forms the core of the recent debate about moral testimony. Those who have come to be known as pessimists about dependence on moral testimony defend the asymmetry thesis. There are a couple different types of pessimists. Epistemic pessimists about dependence on moral testimony hold, most basically, that while you can get epistemic warrant rising to the level of knowledge, or at least justified belief, or credence, or choose your favorite epistemic word there, from non-moral testimony, you can't get the same level of epistemic warrant from moral testimony. So moral testimony precludes something like moral knowledge. Defenders of this view are people like Michael Cholby, Tony Cody, Julia Driver, and Sarah McGrath. So a pretty significant camp of well-respected philosophers think this is true of dependence on moral testimony. You can't get moral knowledge from it. I'm not going to engage with those people today. I'm just going to assume that you can. I think that there's really good reasons to think that you can, and if it comes out in Q&A, we can talk a bit about that. But I'm going to assume that you can get moral knowledge from moral testimony, and then you might think, well, what's the problem then, right? If it looks like testimony with respect to getting knowledge, non-moral testimony, why I think that there's a problem with dependence on moral testimony. It's because there's a separate camp of pessimists, what I call practical pessimists, that allow that you can get moral knowledge from dependence on moral testimony, in just the same way you can get non-moral knowledge from dependence on non-moral testimony. But the people in this camp maintain that there's something wrong with dependence on moral testimony because it's practically problematic. It's in tension with ideals of good moral agency, usually either ideals of autonomy or ideals of moral understanding. People in this camp include Roger Crisp, Allison Hills, Robert Hopkins, and Phil Nickel. In contrast to pessimists, epistemic and practical, are optimists, those that believe that dependence on moral testimony is not essentially problematic, either epistemically or morally, and that you can, in fact, depend on moral testimony, and indeed, sometimes it is good to do so. My project here today is to defend a new version of optimism about dependence on moral testimony. Whereas all going optimist defenses of dependence on moral testimony have portrayed it as second best by centering on how and why it's an important means to overcoming our defects, I argue that the value of dependence on moral testimony goes beyond this. It is not only our flaws and limitations that justify our dependence on moral testimony, but also the importance of such dependence for the flourishing of our most intimate relations. On my view, dependence on moral testimony is not in tension with the ideals of moral agency, as practical pessimists suggest, nor is it simply for those who cannot, nor is it simply for those who cannot realize the ideals of moral agency, as going optimists have suggested. Rather, dependence on moral testimony is among the ideals of moral agency. So my strategy today is as follows. First, I want to show how going defenses of dependence on moral testimony have portrayed it as second best. Next, I'm going to give my own positive argument for my view that there's value in depending on a friend's moral testimony in particular. I'm going to argue that this value is non-remedial. It goes beyond the value of resolving moral uncertainty in light of our epistemic limitations, and is instead grounded in the ways that dependence expresses the trust that is constitutive of the ideal of friendship, and I'll unpack all that. Finally, I want to conclude by showing how my account is tied to testimony in particular, and not just moral deference per se. So Eric Weiland, Karen Jones, David Enoch, and Paulina Sliwa, all optimists about dependence on moral testimony, present defenses which all center on how our epistemic limitations work to justify our deference and dependence on moral testimony. You have on your handout a number of passages that make this point plain. I'll just highlight a couple of those key parts. Eric Weiland writes, for example, recognizing your own naivete and limitations, you are wise to defer to those who know better. Karen Jones writes, while the virtuous person might not herself have all the capacities necessary for virtue, she will know when she needs the moral help of others. And David Enoch writes that we should depend on moral testimony because, as with all imperfections, once they're there, it's better to acknowledge them and act in a way that takes their existence into account. On these views, dependence on moral testimony is a remedial virtue. It is valuable only because it helps us to deal with the ways in which we are flawed or the ways in which we have gone wrong or fallen short. It is in this sense that current defenses of dependence on moral testimony only go so far as to show that such dependence is second best. So far as they go, I find these views convincing, although I'll not argue for their success today. But as I argue, these defenses do not wholly capture the value of dependence on moral testimony. Our epistemic limitations and the need to avoid moral error, while important, are not the only features of a situation that could justify dependence on moral testimony. So, to begin to see this, note that we are often confronted with bits of moral testimony, even when we have not exhausted our own deliberations, and even when we are not of a mind that others are necessarily epistemically better situated than we are with regard to the matter at hand. That is, and in contrast to the cases presented in the literature up to this point, we are sometimes confronted with a bit of moral testimony that is unsolicited. And so that testimony finds us with our own views, right? And sometimes we actually solicit moral testimony prior to exhausting our own deliberations. I think this is pretty familiar. Again, imagine a coworker with whom you share all the relevant non-moral information comes up to you after a department meeting and tells you that the prevailing workplace culture is hostile to minorities. You ask a dear friend to read over your email to tell you if it's rude, because you're tired, right? In such cases, even if you would be able to successfully deliberate on the relevant moral matter on your own, there remains the normative question of whether there is value in depending on the testifier's moral testimony. I want to argue that to answer this question, and to more fully appreciate the topography of dependence on moral testimony, we should, in part, think carefully about the varied relationships that might hold between hearers and testifiers. And this is really adding a new element into the debate about moral testimony. So far, writers on moral testimony have tended to proceed in their analyses under very abstract understandings of what dependence on moral testimony really looks like in our everyday lives, rather than focusing on the different sorts of relationships within which such dependence takes place. To see this, I ask you to consider an example of moral testimony that's really been taken as a paradigm case in the literature. And I'll just sidebar here, I think it's a really problematic case because it's a case in which moral disagreement seems pretty reasonable and prevails, so it's a sort of muddy case, and we can talk about that during Q&A, but I'm gonna set that aside for now. So it's the case on your handout there, vegetarian. Eleanor has always enjoyed eating meat, but recently realized that it raises some moral issues. Rather than thinking further about these, however, she talks to a friend who tells her that eating meat is wrong. Eleanor knows that her friend is normally trustworthy and reliable, so she believes her and accepts that eating meat is wrong. In this case, and in the vast run of examples in the moral testimony literature, the testifier is a friend. Well, why is that? Why, if at all, does it matter whether the testifier in vegetarian and in other cases is a friend? Well, the reason is not made explicit in the literature, but I think we can readily discern it. If dependence on moral testimony is good because it can correct for our flaws and shortcomings, then the reason why the friendship matters in these cases is because we're more likely to be in a position with friends to see why they are reliable or to see that defeaters are not present, right? Going up to a stranger on the street does not seem like a very reliable method of resolving your moral uncertainty. For example, Eleanor needs to be in a position to know about the testifier's reliability in order that her dependence be epistemically sound, and presumably Eleanor would have more evidence of a friend's rather than a stranger's reliability. It appears then that philosophers who have written in defense of moral testimony have assumed that it's not fundamentally important whether the relationship between the testifier and the hearer of the testimony is impersonal, we might say, or personal. That is, they have assumed that the only relationship which matters fundamentally between the hearer and testifier is that of seeker of truth and reliable evidential source. This assumption, I contend, has obscured the possibility that dependence on moral testimony need not be only morally second best. Of course, we sometimes turn to the faceless voices of talk radio or perhaps philosophy blogs and the like for a bit of moral guidance. And of course, we also sometimes depend upon and take up the moral belief of large-scale social institutions like religious organizations, corporations, and nations, sometimes in troubling ways. But very often we depend on the moral testimony of our intimates, our mentors, our friends, our spouses, and so on. There remain to be asked substantive questions about whether and how these intimate relations should affect our appraisal of dependence on moral testimony. I propose then that we look at cases of dependence on moral testimony that crop up in one important paradigm of intimate relationships, I'll stick with friendships, and investigate how the relationship itself makes a difference, if at all, to the value of dependence on moral testimony. I'll turn now to lay out my positive argument in defense of dependence on moral testimony. My aim is to argue that friendship is not merely relevant in order to serve as evidence of testifier's reliability. Hopefully that's no surprise at this point, but can itself make a difference to the value of dependence on moral testimony. More specifically, I want to argue that there can be non-remedial value in having a disposition to depend on a friend's moral testimony. I promised to talk about dispositions. I think that's the important thing to talk about here. So such a disposition is a belief-forming disposition. To have it is to have a sort of doxastic habit. Under normal circumstances, when confronted with a testifier's moral testimony, a hearer with the relevant disposition will come to believe the testimony on the basis of the testifier's say-so. Furthermore, it is a belief-forming disposition that is relationship-based. By this I mean that it is not a disposition to depend on the moral testimony of just anyone who you take to be reliable, but a disposition to depend on the moral testimony of the particular people with whom you are friends because they are your friend. My view is that depending on friends' moral testimony can be non-instrumentally valuable as an expression of the trust that is partially constitutive of the ideal of friendship. Now, to argue this, I want to first show that reciprocal dependence is one important way by which we express the trust that is constitutive of the ideal of friendship. And then I want to show how reciprocal dependence on friends for goods, in particular, the good of moral knowledge, can be constitutively valuable in friendship. So as we all know, dependence in friendship sometimes gets a bad rap, which might give rise to some initial hesitation towards my view. Just consider that relationships are often called out as dysfunctional by labeling them as codependent or emotionally dependent. But consider the following examples. Deb, who's a student, gets encouragement to keep working from her friend Joan, who regularly checks in with her about how her thesis is progressing. Or Patty, who is a student, gets regular check-ins from Nick, who is her partner, right? Darren uses his friend's John's donated blood for his transfusion therapy. Jane, who is shy and introverted, gets help from her friend Mary in navigating social engagements. Lynn relies on her friend Neil to watch over her house when she travels. These examples, I take it, provide illustration of a couple of important things. First, they suggest that dependence in friendship is utterly common. While common, however, the nature of dependence in friendship is varied. We depend on our friends in mundane, everyday contexts in which the stakes of our dependence are relatively low. But we also depend on them at momentous periods in our lives when the stakes of our dependence are exceedingly high. Second, I think those examples illustrate that sometimes we depend on our friends for goods that we could, at least in some sense, provide for ourselves. Deb could download an app that helps her to manage her writing schedule. Darren could use blood from an anonymous donor. Jane could buy some self-help books and try her own hand at making introductions at parties. Lynn could install an alarm system or ask a watchful neighbor to keep tabs on our house. Simply put, we often depend on our friends, even when we could eradicate our dependence on them. But while sometimes we reduce our dependence on friends, the idea of removing dependence wholesale, I think we find troubling. The dependencies in the examples I offered, and many of the dependencies in our own lives and friendships, seem themselves to be good. That we often see acts of dependence as important milestones in friendship bolsters this intuition. Consider the following. Bess is planning to attend an out-of-state conference for work. Her friend Janine, who she met at her previous place of employment, lives nearby the convention center and hotel where the conference is being held. Bess's work is willing to cover her hotel expenses, but rather than reserve a room, Bess decides to stay with Janine. We can readily imagine that this arrangement, Bess's chosen dependence on Janine for accommodations, marks a sort of turning point in Bess and Janine's relationship. They now begin to see each other as the sorts of close friends who open up their homes to each other and who visit each other, even if that entails traveling cross country. The intuition that it's good to depend on our friends gets even further support by imagining a friendship that was once characterized by a high level of mutual dependence, but now is marked by increasing independence from one another. We might say of such a friendship that friends had become distant or that they'd grown apart. Imagine what we would think of individuals who, without any pressing need, attempted to remove all dependencies on their friends. In some instances, attempting to eradicate particular dependencies seems unproblematic. If I decide I want to take up baking, it may be perfectly fine for me to halt depending on my friend to supply me with delicious baked goods. But to adopt the aim of becoming entirely independent of a friend's goodwill for goods really seems at odds with being in a good friendship, and perhaps even a friendship at all. So it looks like it's good to depend on our friends, but why? In large part, I take it that it is good to depend on our friends because by doing so, we express our trust in them. Think again of the examples of dependence that I laid out just a bit earlier. In each example, the depender is vulnerable to the dependee. Deb is vulnerable to Joan forgetting to call. Darren is vulnerable to John refusing to donate his blood. Jane is vulnerable to Mary for leading her astray in the ways of social graces. Lynn is vulnerable to Neil neglecting to care for her most prized possessions. By choosing to depend on our friends, we choose to make ourselves vulnerable. After all, our friends could fail to deliver what we depend on them for. And choosing to make ourselves vulnerable to our friends is, I take it, an expression of our trust in them. So being disposed to depend on our friends is an important way by which we express our trust in them. And trust, it strikes me, is a core constitutive element of an ideal friendship. By this, I don't just mean that it's central to friendship to regard one's friends as trustworthy. Just as you can judge something valuable without valuing it, you can view someone as trustworthy without trusting him. I might judge that my coworker's spouse is trustworthy because she, who I know to be reliable, has told me story after story in which he shows up as a trustworthy and dependable person. But though I think well of him, that does not mean I trust him. If I have not met him, for example, it doesn't seem that our lives are entangled enough and in the ways that trust seems to require. It is trusting, and not merely judging to be trustworthy, that seems so central to friendship. Right? So actively making oneself vulnerable, trusting. Nor when I say that trusting is constitutive of the ideal of friendship, do I mean to engage in the project of giving a reductive analysis of friendship. Thank you for Andy for helping me to add this point in yesterday. Indeed, I'm happy to allow that good and true friendships can withstand lapses of trust, but what I am contending is that trusting, as an ideal of friendship, can serve as a guide on how to conduct our relationships. Of course, we can go too far in depending on our friends and intimates. Recall, for example, many of you know this, Hill's infamous example of the deferential housewife. This is the woman who's utterly devoted to serving her husband. She buys the clothes he prefers, invites the guests he wants to entertain, and makes love whenever he's in the mood. She willingly moves to a new city in order for him to have a more attractive job, counting her own friendships and geographical preferences insignificant by comparison. She tends not to form her own interests, values, and ideals. And when she does, she counts them as less important than her husband's, right? I imagine that all of us have some unease about this case. There's actually quite a big cottage literature about pinpointing exactly what makes us uneasy about this case. But among the many things that are troubling about this case, two are particularly relevant to the topic at hand. First, it strikes me that part of what seems so disturbing about the wife's deference to her husband is just how far-reaching it is. The wife depends on her husband not only for material comforts, but also, as Tom Hill says, her, quote, interests, values, and ideals. She depends on him to such an extent that she has become, as he suggests, servile. Extensive dependence on our friends could also lead to other moral failings, such as laziness. So to say that dependence on friends is valuable is not to say that it should be pursued to the extreme. It's also not to say that it's the only thing of value. Indeed, the value of dependence should be situated and pursued along other ideals, such as independence. A second reason the deferential wife case is troubling, I take it, is because the dependence in the case is so one-sided. This suggests that for dependence to play a role in constituting the ideals of friendship, it must be reciprocal, two-sided, so that there's not massive inequality between friends. This reciprocity of dependence should not be merely understood quantitatively, but also qualitatively. We can imagine, for example, that the husband in this case depends on his wife for all sorts of things. In fact, sort of the picture of the husband you get, right? He depends on her for his meals, a clean house, and maybe the weather reports. Even so, if that's how we want to describe the case, the dependence in the relationship is still grossly imbalanced because the husband depends on his wife in ways that only are, relative to his dependence, or her dependence on him, trivial. One-sided dependence can signal a departure from the ideal of friendship, and in particularly extreme cases, such as the deferential wife case, it might actually lead to an utter breakdown of friendship. Here, an analogy with beneficence is apt. Kant writes of beneficence, and here I'm going to quote briefly, "The relationship of friendship is a relation of equality. A friend who bears my losses becomes my benefactor, not my friend, and puts me in his debt. I feel shy in his presence and cannot look him boldly in the face. The true relationship is canceled and friendship ceases." Imagine two benevolent friends who, by reciprocally adopting each other's interests, shore up their friendship. The friendship may well withstand a temporary foundering of this reciprocity. If for some reason, maybe one of the friends becomes sick or takes on a big project at work, the beneficence becomes temporarily one-sided. But if the collapse of reciprocity were more drastic and long-lasting, it might end the friendship as such. And so I think the same is true of dependence. So to sum up at this point, reciprocal dependence is one important way by which we express trust that is constitutive of the ideal of friendship. But as the deferential wife case illustrates, that trust is a constitutive element of the ideal of friendship does not mean that every expression of trust is thereby good. It might be pointed out then that even granting that reciprocal dependence in friendship is valuable in the ways that I have contended, this does not yet show that dependence on moral testimony is constitutively valuable for friendship. In other words, why should we think that a particular type of dependence on a friend's moral testimony, is valuable? Well, first, note that the intuitively good examples of dependence from the beginning of this section all involve depending on friends for things that are valuable, such as extra accountability at work, medical treatment, social graces, and protection of property. Contrast this with codependence. Codependents depend on one another to prop up unhealthy or immoral behaviors, such as addiction or abuse. This difference suggests a way forward, a way to carve out the types of dependence that are valuable. These types of dependence are depending on our friends for goods, right? And since moral knowledge is a good, then depending on our friends for moral knowledge, i.e. depending on their moral testimony, can express the trust which is constitutive of the ideal of friendship. But even if we grant that the reciprocal dependence on moral testimony can be constitutively valuable in friendship, we might still wonder if people could be great friends and yet not depend on each other for the good of moral knowledge, so long as they depended on one another for other goods. My response to this line of thinking is twofold, and that's laid out on your handout. First, due to the centrality of moral knowledge to our agency and our ways of seeing the world, it strikes me as plausible that moral knowledge is indeed privileged in such a way that the ideal of friendship would probably be undermined by friends failing to be disposed to depend on one another's moral testimony. Right? Consider a case from Troy Jollimer. He says, suppose Agnes is told by a third party that her friend Brad was unacceptably rude to Phil. Brad's account of the event is that he was only responding to some comments Phil made, comments that Brad interpreted as rude and insulting. Had she been present, Agnes would have been able to judge for herself whether Phil's comments were indeed rude and whether Brad's response was reasonable or also rude. But Agnes was not present, and so she had to rely on the testimony of those who were there, including Brad. Now picture the many other situations involving moral testimony like this that are likely to crop up in Agnes's and Brad's friendship. For example, Brad testifying to Agnes about his sister's generosity, about the sexism in a recent advertising campaign, about the importance of fossil fuel divestment. If Agnes were not disposed to depend on Brad's moral testimony one whit, and instead remained agnostic about his testimony across the board until she formed opinions on her own, we might think of her as lacking the sort of trust that's essential to the ideal of friendship. But even if moral knowledge is not privileged in this way, even if people can in fact be great friends without having the disposition I've defended, my point that dependence on moral testimony can have non-remedial value is not undermined. For the fact that there is more than one way to express the trust that is constitutive of the ideal of dependence, for the fact that there is more than one way to express the trust that is constitutive of the ideal of friendship does not at all cut against the view that one of these ways has positive value. To illustrate this point by silly analogy, that there are multiple good ways to make delicious bread does not make any one of them non-valuable as a way of making bread. As I explained above, going optimist defenses of dependence on moral testimony do not ascribe any positive non-remedial value to dependence at all. So even if reciprocal dependence on moral testimony is not essential to the ideal of friendship, that does not undermine the fact that the view I've put forth and defended shows that dependence on moral testimony can have positive, non-remedial value, at least in some friendships. Right? It can be constitutive of the trust of at least some types of friendship. So now I want to talk about moral testimony in particular. The non-remedial value of the disposition that I have argued for is, I take it, most relevant in cases in which our friend's moral testimony is addressed to us, offered to us, and addressed to us in such a way as to function as an invitation to accept the testimony just on their say-so. Unpacking this point, which I'm about to do, will help to make clear how my account is tied to getting moral knowledge by way of testimony in particular. Let me explain. So philosophers writing on about dependence on moral testimony have exhibited a tendency to treat dependence as just a standard case of moral deference. These philosophers hold that there's nothing special, normatively speaking, about testimony, just like other types of deference. One such prominent view on the current scene is that of epistemic pessimist Sarah McGrath. She writes, and here I'm going to quote a bit, "Although it's sometimes claimed that there's something strange about moral testimony, any such strangeness is just a case of a more general phenomenon. Suppose that you actively attempt to conceal your opposition to capital punishment from me. Nevertheless, I discover that you strongly disapprove of capital punishment, perhaps by observing your involuntary grimaces whenever others mention the practice in your presence. As a result, I adopt your strongly negative attitude as my own. On the face of this, it seems no more or less odd than a case in which I defer to you about the morality of capital punishment after learning the view on the basis of your testimony." It's like this view that I'm really concerned to respond to. Here, McGrath claims that in our evaluative analyses, we should treat an agent's deference to another just the same if the agent discovers her belief by accident as if the testifier states her belief for the purposes of convincing the agent. On McGrath's view, whatever we conclude about the moral status of moral testimony in particular will apply to moral deference in general. Clearly, to depend on moral testimony is to defer to someone's say-so. But to simply lump moral deference and moral testimony together, as McGrath has done, is to ignore the pragmatic and moral texture of address. When people address us, they might be doing a number of different things. At one extreme, it seems that sometimes when people tell us things, they aren't even trying to present the content of their assertion as evidence at all. Imagine that your spouse comes home after a rough day and telling you about her day, she dishes out all sorts of juicy moral assessments about her coworkers and clients. This may, to an outsider, look like a case of straightforward moral testimony, but you may well know, depending on the circumstances, that your partner is just venting. Her tellings are expressive and perhaps therapeutic, and she intends for you to listen without updating your credences, commitments, or actions in any way based on what she says. In contrast, people often tell us things expressly in an attempt to get us to update our credences. But even here, though, they may do so in a way that does not invite us to defer to their say-so. Sometimes they intend to do so by way of facilitating our own autonomous judgment. As the venerable Elizabeth Anscombe writes, in teaching philosophy, we do not hope that our pupils will believe us, but rather that they will come to see that what we say is true if it is. So in teaching philosophy, we are merely offering up the content of our assertions as evidence, not asking our students to place their trust in us. This is sometimes the way it goes with moral testimony. One way to think about what my friend is doing when she tells me eating meat is cruel, assuming that she and I share all the same non-moral information, is that she's trying to get me to see for myself the wrongness of eating meat under some thick moral description. That is, she's merely inviting me to see the immorality of eating meat for myself and not asking me to place my confidence in her as a moral agent. Alternatively, though, part of what our interlocutors might be doing in addressing their testimony to us is inviting us to give uptake to their testimony by taking their say-so as sufficient reason for belief. Testifiers often indicate this by prefacing their statements with, for example, trust me, as in, trust me, you don't want to know him any better. It is in these sorts of cases, cases in which we are in effect invited to depend, that we're most likely to encounter the value of dependence that I defend. Value that goes beyond merely correcting for our epistemic limitations, and that what makes for what we might call first best dependence, or non-remedial dependence. It makes a normative difference, this is what I'm trying to argue, whether we take up others' moral views in response to their invitation to depend, or just because we incidentally gleaned their views from an encounter. Consider this example. I observe that my spouse is concerned about the health of our dog, but he doesn't tell me because he doesn't want me to worry. Somehow, I rightly gather that this is what he thinks, though. Even if my spouse were to find out that I knew of his concern, since his whole point was to endeavor to protect me from worry, it would be a bit funny if he were to feel upset if I didn't adopt his attitude of concern. In contrast, now imagine that my spouse explicitly tells me that he's concerned about our dog's condition, and that he thinks that as a conscientious pet owner, we must visit a specialist. In this case, my spouse might very reasonably feel insult or resentment if I refuse to, in some way, give uptake to his concerns. Partly perhaps because he thinks I should care about the health of our dog, that's a straightforward explanation of the case, but also because they're his concerns and he's addressed them to me. Right? Part of the reason he wants me to care about the dog is because he's brought it to my attention, and he'd like me to take what he's brought to my attention seriously. We can imagine, I think, that if this instance played into a pattern of behavior on my part, if I regularly refused my spouse's invitations to take up his concerns and moral views on his say-so, that it might harm our relationship. As I've argued, it can be valuable to the relationship for us to depend on our friends for moral knowledge, but there can be added normative import when we depend on them for moral knowledge by way of their moral testimony in particular. For if we refuse to take up our friends' moral views in response to their moral testimony, when their testimony functions, as I think it does in some cases, as an invitation to accept what they say just based on their say-so, we risk treating our partners and our friends poorly and undermining our relationships in a way that we do not when our friends are not addressing their moral views to us at all. So to recap, I have tried to argue that going defenses of dependence on moral testimony fail to fully appreciate the value of such dependence. The value of dependence on moral testimony is not only grounded in the ways in which such dependence serve to remedy our epistemic limitations, but also the ways in which such dependence, by expressing trust, is constitutive of ideals of friendship. On my view, then, dependence on moral testimony can have non-remedial value. And my next project, I'll just signal this before you go into Q&A, is what I've been doing here is assuming all along that our friends are reliable, but as we know, our friends are often unreliable, and sometimes in subtle and troubling ways. So now the project I'm working on is trying to figure out sort of the limits of the value of such a disposition and what value, if any, it has in the context of friendships where we either lack information about the reliability of our friends or perhaps even have evidence of their unreliability. So that's where I'll leave.